And also things like the time span of each ego of ourselves is different. I mean, you'll notice in your own life, time has you have a different experience of time at different points of your life. So the unity of this ego in these mental states are also quite difficult to define. But there is something that gives them a sense of holding together. Another characteristic of the ego he points out is this feeling of essential privacy. And what he means by that is that each one of us has our own desires, pleasures, and pains. And we reach different conclusions with regards to different matters. So the self, in that sense, is really quite unique and really hard to describe or pinpoint. And it seems to be working in a way that's really quite complex. So this feeling of I that we have is a unique interrelationship of these different mental states. But what is the nature of this I? Is it a substance? Is it something that you can measure, that's tangible? And Iqbal actually posits that we can't reach the ego, the self, other than through the interpretation of conscious experience. So then what is consciousness? And as Mehboob talked about before lunch, consciousness is something that is presupposed and exists in all mental life. And consciousness is both inside and outside of the self. Iqbal actually, in his words, he says, the life of the ego is a kind of tension caused by the environment invading the ego and the ego invading the environment. The ego is present in this arena of mutual invasion as a directive energy that is formed and disciplined by its own experience. So you can begin to see how complicated, even through modern knowledge, this description of what the self or ego is. But having looked at kind of the modern knowledge and having kind of arrived at these questions as Iqbal does, he then draws on the Quran. And he draws on verse 1785, and he quotes, "And they ask thee of the soul, say, the soul proceedeth from my Lord's amr," it's my Lord's command, "but of knowledge only a little to you is given." And he says that in this verse, the terms that are used are khalaq and amr to convey how the creative activity of God reveals itself to us. Khalaq means creation, and amr means direction. And so actually Iqbal concludes that the essential nature of the ego or the self is directive. It proceeds from the directive energy of God. And so this leads him to argue that the ego or the self is not a thing, but an act. And this is really important because his whole philosophy is based on action. So for him, experience is a series of acts mutually referring to one another and held together by the unity of this directive purpose. And so myself or my ego can only really be interpreted or understood in terms of my directive attitude. Okay? That's yourself, is that directive attitude, your wills, your aims, your judgments, your aspirations, and so forth. I don't know if that was the conclusion that any of you came to when you thought of what yourself actually was. This act, this directive energy. So the next questions he asks is, well, how does the ego actually emerge? And here he grapples with Descartesian mind-body dualism. And, he actually thinks that the approach of parallelism or interaction in terms of understanding the relationship between the mind and body in the emergence of the ego are both flawed. He thinks they're both unsatisfactory, and instead he argues that where you see the mind and body come together is in action. And he sees both mind and body as essentially being the self and both being systems of acts. He says the characteristic of the ego is spontaneity. The acts comprising the body repeat themselves. and the body is only accumulated action or the habit of the soul. And so he proposes that it's actually out of matter, out of this lower order, that a colony of egos, that the ego of a higher order emerges. And when their association and interaction reach a certain degree of coordination, we reach a point of self-guidance, wherein the ultimate ego, that's God, reality, reveals its secrets and gives us clues to its ultimate nature. So the higher for him emerges out of the lower. And he says, there's no problem with this, because even if you look at biology or the evolution of life, in the beginning, mental life is dominated by the physical. The mental, as it grows in power, tends to dominate the physical and may eventually even gain position of complete independence over it. And you can think about that even in terms of your own development as a child. So the ultimate ego is the directive force that makes the emergent emerge, and it's immanent in nature. And it's described in the Quran. And again, I love the way he draws on the verses in the Quran. And this is actually a beautiful verse to reflect on in terms of the self and the relationship with God, which is, the verse that God is the first, the last, the visible, and the invisible. So this reasoning that he goes through in the reconstruction of religious thought, in trying to discover what the ego or the self is, and coming to the conclusion that it's a directive energy and act that is emergent from the ultimate ego, actually becomes the basis of his philosophy of Khudi. This is what he builds on in his Asrar-i-khudi. And Abdul Rashid Siddiqui has a book called Man and Destiny, which covers Iqbal's philosophy of Khudi, and he traces the development of the word Khudi itself, actually, which is quite interesting in Persian and Urdu. And he points out that the term Khudi was actually pretty obscure until the 13th century, and it's actually Rumi in his Mafnavi that introduces and begins to develop the idea of Khudi, of self-awareness and self-reliance. And it's interesting, for those of you who speak kind of Urdu, I don't know so much about Persian, but it has all sorts of connotations, that term. And Rashid Siddiqui points out that, even post the 13th century and Rumi's use of the term, the word Khudi is still often used with connotations of vanity and arrogance, especially in relation to the prevailing Sufi ideas of the time, which emphasized self-abasement and suppression. So Iqbal, who was greatly influenced by Rumi, he sees Rumi as his spiritual guide, took up the word, and instead of implying the meaning of arrogance and vanity, he tried to define it as self-realization and self-affirmation. And he actually describes Khudi as self-reliance, self-respect, self-confidence, and self-preservation. In another place he describes, and I think this is quite beautiful, he describes it as, he's saying Khudi is an emotional unity or a bright thing of the conscious by which all human ideas and inspirations are enlightened. This is an eternal reality which is a binding force for the scattered and unlimited mental states. It is a silent force which is anxious to come into action. That's quite beautiful to say that Khudi is a silent force which is anxious to come into action. In another poetic verse, he describes it as this: the abode of Khudi is within your heart, as the sky is within the pupil of your eye. Yeah, so it's something that that's visible, but it's far off, it's distant, so it's a process. And this Khudi is a process like a horizon, but already within your eyesight.